All right, everyone, we are going to continue our discussion of culture, but now we're really going to hone in on our first really point of study here, which would be language. And we're going to specifically look at how do languages change and emerge over time. So just to get us on the common page here, language is a system of communication through the use of speech, collection of sounds, and understood by a group of people to have the same meaning. You should immediately notice that there's nothing here about written, that a language doesn't have to be written in order to be considered a language. In fact, as you well know from your own language courses, the acquisition, speaking a language and reading a language and writing a language are three very, very different skill sets. And so language can be exclusively oral, or it too can have a system of writing associated with it. We went through these in class, but just generally speaking, to help us understand why language is so important is because I love this particular phrase that language is a flash of the human spirit. I just love the expression of how language can be such a key component of cultural existence and truly is the medium. It's the way in which culture is expressed by different groups of people. So one component of language is that I just want to quickly address are dialects. So dialects are a regional variation of a language. So again, we got that spatial piece here, spatial analysis. That languages can vary over space, and that dialect is distinguished by vocabulary. So maybe one area of the world calls this one thing, one calls it another in the same language. When the spelling of words, you've seen this if you've seen British English, where you see O-U-R instead of just O-R, O-R in written, or if you see S's in a place where you would write a Z, those are going to be regional dialects, regional variations of English. And pronunciation, the way that we pronounce different words, like water, coffee, right, versus water and coffee. So dialects are there, but however, there isn't always a clear distinction between what a language is and what a dialect is, in the sense of sometimes those differences and the degree of the differences can be so drastic that some people feel like they're speaking a different language. A good example of that is that movie. Oh God, what is it called? Snatch, right? It's an older movie. I'd be surprised if you guys seen it now. But there's in that movie they're speaking Pickney English, and I have to turn on the subtitles in it. I can't even understand what they're saying, and they're speaking in English, right? So it's the dialect is sort of that regional variation within a language. So just two kind of basic components of what language is. And this here is a map of just seeing what you would call a soft drink that you and I here in DC are likely to call it just soda. We'd say, I want to go get a soda. But you can see clearly in other areas of the world that if you'd said to me, especially in the South, if you say, I'm going to go get a Coke, I would have a very clear picture that you'd be getting a red bottle and with silver writing on it. But that's not necessarily the case. It's a clear, easy distinction between a dialect, or different dialects of places. Okay, so back to our real essential question. How do languages emerge and change over time? So languages, there's something called language convergence and language divergence. Convergence, just in general, if lines converge, you know in math that means they're coming closer together. And divergence is, of course, they're moving farther away from one another. So languages, this is a real building block, and this is just the continuation of our discussion on acculturation and assimilation and the way in which cultures interact with each other. Because as languages can influence one another, that's our convergence piece. And languages can also move away from one another and become increasingly divergent. That helps us understand what you were looking at on the bottom of the screen here, what are known as language trees and language families. And we're seeing here, let me see if I can enlarge this a little bit. You can see here that languages come, I love the visualization piece here, that a language branch or language family can truly emerge over time. So here we have the language tree, right, or this tree, and we see that languages can converge and languages can diverge, right? Languages emerge. Where do languages come from? They come from isolation, right? When people and groups of people are isolated from one another, they must figure out methods of communication, and therefore, in that isolated community, they will develop some sort of communication strategy, some sort of language. Languages change over time because of interactions and the experiences of the people. So as groups of people interact with one another, particularly through migration and they move over space, then those interactions are going to lead to changes in the language. It's going to lead to new vocabulary. It's going to lead to new words for things in general. As people experience things for the first time, those words will emerge. So that's sort of the historical example of the changes and emergence of language. But that still applies to this day. The languages remain as they are because of isolation. So, for example, a dialect may remain that dialect because that group of people only interacts with people who are similar to them. And that language may change over time as that group of people interacts and has a different experiences that in turn will shape the language. So maybe, for example, I know in French they incorporate the word chewing gum is pronounced chewing gum. It's just directly inserted into the French language using the English spelling. That's an example of those interactions of English and French speakers changing the language itself. So consequently, when we study linguistics, linguistics is anything related to language, right? When we study linguistics, we are essentially studying a map of human history, because if languages are the product of the isolation of people, or languages are the product of the interactions of people, then essentially when we look at the historical emergence of languages and those convergence and those points of convergence and those points of divergence, we are doing nothing more than just mapping those human migrations over time and mapping these human interactions over time. So what you're looking at there is actually the language families and the distribution of language families. This, again, is a language family, and we're tracing languages that have common ancestors, common roots. We'll talk a little bit later about those classifications of languages, of what makes a language family versus this branch or group. But bottom line here is that languages converge, they interact with one another, and they diverge. They're isolated and they move away from one another and remain distinct from one another. As I just mentioned the classification of languages represents those interactions between people. So the way we classify a language as being part of this language family and this language group or this language branch, really what we're tracking is we're going back to the origin of the language. For example, for the Indo-European language family, and there's different discussions here about how these languages diffused and why they diffused. But generally speaking, the somewhat agreed upon hearth here, the Indo-European language family, is located in this Fertile Crescent region. And we see that the diffusion of the Indo-European dialects, as that we can use the languages to map back that classification, the classification of the language to map back the history of the people there. And we can see the points of origin and the spreads of those languages from there. Similarly here, we got the hearth of the Niger-Congo family, Afro-Asiatic, things I'll come back to, and we see the diffusion of that language. And those interactions and the consequential isolation of languages helps us understand why the languages have emerged as they are. Just blown up versions of these things. I'm going to skip those. Okay. Another way that a language can emerge is through what's called a pidgin language. So a pidgin language can emerge when it's a form of speech that's adopted simplified grammar and vocabulary. So it's helpful for me to remember this like a bird. If two birds are trying to interact with each other, the two pigeons, right, even though that, of course, is spelled differently, this pidgin language is very simplified. It says me, you, trade, ball, for, food, whatever, right? Very simplified structure of speech, simply to try to communicate between two people who speak different languages, right? So you can see that this is, that's actually here the example I provided for you. This pidgin Hawaiian, right, that developed when Chinese plantation workers and Hawaiians first interacted. Two different speakers of a different languages. Those two languages converge into this pidgin language. And then eventually what happens as a pidgin language evolves, it evolves into a mother tongue. So we sort of just traced the language cultural convergence here. They've got two speakers of different languages. They start with a pidgin language. It's just going to be the very bare bone basics to try to communicate. That evolves into a Creole language, which is a pidgin language that evolved into a mother tongue. And generally speaking, Creole is going to be, I'm sorry, that was an unclear transition. That the pidgin language, eventually, it will evolve to and become more structured and more formulaic and more uniform, such that it actually becomes the mother tongue of people. That's the difference between the pidgin language and the Creole. Creole is also just a generalized term to describe the mixing of two languages. So when you've got, a lot of people associate that with the language of Haiti, but which is often referred to as Creole, as a mix of French and English, but that's not enough. The Creole can be used to describe the mix of any two of these languages, such that it becomes the mother tongue of a group of people. So just two clear examples of cultural convergence, right? Now let's talk about cultural divergence, or really just what happens to cultures, to languages over time here. That what can often happen, and this is a connection to our discussion around acculturation, is that sometimes we, as languages interact with one another, one language, this quote-unquote stronger language, will actually overtake the weaker language. Depending on the extent to which this happens, if it's just partially, then that can be under acculturation. If it's total, then we'll talk about that as an example of assimilation. This is typically motivated by political control. So typically when one group of people want to politically control another region, they will come in and their language will be forced upon the people, and thus we'll start to see the beginnings of language replacement where the colonizer power's language is going to take control. So again, we already talked about this, but the historical reason that you'd have language replacement would be because as a result of colonialism and imperialism, which when the European powers began to exert their control over different areas of the world and claiming it as their own territory. And in turn, they would take their stronger language, which was typically English or French or German, and they would impose that language upon the people that they were colonizing. That would lead to language replacement. Oftentimes, languages are replaced. Those native languages are both historically and in modern day are being replaced with lingua francas. Lingua francas are common languages that are used of speakers for different languages. So, for example, if three people came to a business meeting, one Japanese person, um, one Portuguese person, and one Argentinian person came together at a business meeting, well, they might likely choose a lingua franca to communicate in since they all speak different languages. They may choose English, which is the most common lingua franca for business. So lingua francas are not an entirely new language, but it's an example of what's happening to many of the lesser known languages of the world. An example of language replacement is the adoption of a lingua franca instead of the native tongue. So it's, again, not an entirely new language. It's just simply the language that people utilize when two people do not speak the same language. That's that we use a lingua franca, a third language, to try to communicate between them. Some examples of global lingua francas. These are important. Now, this map is deceiving. I need to make this clear. This here says that on the map on the right that English is the official language of the United States. That's incorrect. We do not have an official language in the United States. It is the most widely used language. It's our standard language, but it's not the most wide. It's not an official language. But back to this information on here, that English is generally considered to be the world's lingua franca, the world's common language that people speak in, and that's because of business. That's commerce. Because English is largely becoming the language of globalization. It's becoming the language of those transnational corporations that are going abroad and trying to get cheap labor. So as those companies diffuse from the most developed countries of the world and go to the lesser developed or the developing countries, they in turn are bringing English with them. So business is driving the English becoming a lingua franca. The internet, the language of the internet is largely English. And you can see, actually, I think I had that on the map back here. There we go. Top languages in the internet and millions of users. You can see that English language users are the largest percentage of internet users here. So therefore, English is becoming an increasingly, there are more and more people speaking English because of the internet. And lastly, medicine. A lot of the medical advancements and medical practices are emerging in English and therefore being diffused in English, which too is contributing to English becoming a worldwide lingua franca. Other examples of lingua francas, here we are in, I know some of you have not yet taken World History 2, but here we are in what is now Russia, formerly known as the Soviet Union. Well, the countries here, I referred to them already as the former countries of the Iron Curtain, which are the areas that the Soviet Union controlled. They speak many different languages here. For example, Estonia speaks Estonian. That we have that in this region, however, because this was once controlled by the Soviet Union, in Russia as a whole, because Russia is an incredibly diverse place with many, 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 many different groups of people, the lingua franca there is Russian, right? So this is going to be in this entire former Soviet Union region of Eastern Europe and all of Russia. The lingua franca is Russian. Excuse me. In East Africa, the primary lingua franca to this very, very diverse region is Swahili. And in Southeast Asia, Hindustani is used as another, again, incredibly diverse, particularly linguistically diverse area. That Hindustani is used as a lingua franca to allow people who do not speak the same languages to communicate with one another. Another example of that sort of the interactions and the cultural convergence is that as English diffuses, it continues to cause acculturation when people borrow components of this. So another example of the merger of languages and how they change over time. You can see these examples in the phrases that are very informal, but Spanglish and Franglais. So Spanglish is that fusion of Spanish and English, which is largely present in the cultural transition zone down in Southwest United States in the quote-unquote Tex-Mex region. So you see that a lot of people, both in their spoken word and in some of the even writing, you can see the fusion of the two cultures. That'll be it's fusion of two languages. Or same thing with franglais. It's a fusion of French and English. Anglais is English and French. But and just something that's a little bit interesting is that the French are actually very famous for protecting their language. They have something called the Académie Française, but where they're trying to preserve the sanctity. They're trying to make sure that other languages don't change or French too much. They try to keep French very pure, but they're also just having to face the realities of globalization. That as we get more globalized, and that is English in particular becomes the world's lingua franca, that in turn is going to change their language and affect their language. Now, how do they change? Again, how do languages emerge over time? So we talked about this cultural convergence and how languages interact with one another. And we know from our discussion of acculturation that often these interactions lead to the assimilation and the forced assimilation of the weaker culture into the stronger. And that applies here with languages as well. And sadly, we've got a tremendous number of languages that are being lost in favor of some of the more widely known languages. So the languages that are being endangered, these are languages that are on the brink of extinction. So as more and more globally, this occurs more and more globally as lingua francas emerge, and as the transnational corporations continue to exert their global economic influence and bringing in their businesses, we're seeing that there's a lot of languages that are lost, and languages are becoming endangered, where the last speakers of these languages are dying off without either having taught someone the language or having some written documentation. So you can see some of the language hotspots here around the world, where there are areas of language endangerment. There's also an example, and then the complete process there, the complete loss of the language would lead to what's known as an extinct language. So languages that are no longer spoken or read in daily activities by anyone around the world. So that's the work. The mission of some of the people we talked about in class is to end this process and to try to save these languages before they become extinct languages. Now, what's interesting, though, is that just because a language is gone doesn't necessarily always mean it's gone forever. So these extinctions can be temporary. Because there is something known as a revived language. So a revived language is a language that was extinct but yet has been revived. And the couple key examples of that would be Latin. Latin was the daily language, the spoken word language of the Roman Empire. And then when the Roman Empire fell, and when over time, as the Catholic Church shifted some of their practices away from the use of Latin, the Latin became extinct. It was no longer spoken as the official language of any country or by wide groups of people. But that, of course, is becoming more and more revived. That many high schools still teach Latin as a way to essentially to understand the origins and the roots of many different modern languages. Another great example of a revived language is Hebrew. So Hebrew was an extinct language, but there was a large movement within the Jewish community, specifically with this man, Ben Yehuda, who I'm sure I just butchered that, and I apologize for pronunciation on that. But that he actually worked very hard to make sure that the Hebrew language was revived and that people began to learn Hebrew, so much so that Hebrew is actually now the official language of the country of Israel. Two other examples: Celtic, which is a smaller language that was spoken in Ireland, and Hawaiian. Both languages are experiencing efforts right now to be revived and to ensure that more people are speakers and are literate in these different languages. So there we are. So there's our discussion I'm going to skip over these ones. We'll go over that in class. Here's our discussions of here are the analysis questions here, looking at the evolution and the emergence and evolution and changes of language. All right, thanks, guys.